So you may run into this because you may speak Vedanta and people may misunderstand you and think, oh, you're saying all the religions are the same, but they're not. And many of us want to be nice, and so we say, oh, everything's the same. And you can find, usually people who want to emphasize that look at the ethical and moral preachings of religion, as Swamiji just pointed out, the golden rule is everywhere. But they're also different, and this harmony of unity and diversity is as essential to Vedanta and essential to the way of looking at this. Respect and reverence for the differences is also part of it. And people, of course, like Houston Smith, he wrote the textbook on comparative religion. He knows they're different. But he's the one who pointed out to the world that there's these two aspects of religion that we need to distinguish. One he calls the exoteric, E-X-O-T-E-R-I-C, the exoteric, the outer portion of religion. That's where you find dogma and doctrine and sacred texts and different rituals and different observances. And that's where the differences are. And if you only know that as religion, which is very common in the West, then it's obvious all religions are very different from one another, so where's the similarity? But when you look at what he calls the esoteric, the E-S-O-T-E-R-I-C, that's the inner domain of religion. That's where the experience of the divine is found. That's where the unity of religions are. That's what Ramakrishna discovered when he engaged in Islam and Christianity. The inner experience, he knew God through the differences. He came to the sameness, to the unity of God. That's the true message that needs to be introduced into interfaith work. And to some extent, it has, to a large extent, it has already entered in, at least in the more sophisticated big city gatherings of interfaith. I go to some in Los Angeles where people recognize that. They recognize that the beautiful differences on the exoteric side of it and the deep esoteric sameness that we come to inwardly when we engage in practices that lead to the realization of the divine. And many people, Christians, Jews, Muslims, really welcomed this Vedantic message because it changed the way they practice and engage in their own religion. Not just changed the way they relate to other people of other faiths. This whole notion of calling religions faiths needs to be examined. I mean, Western people use faith as a synonym for religion. Well, you have your faith. This must come as a shock to people from the East, where faith is secondary. Faith is secondary to experience. Faith is an important element in the spiritual life, but it's experience that really matters. It's the experience of the divine. The Dharmic traditions aren't faiths in the usual way. As Swamiji was saying, Vedanta is a science of religion. The principles are there to be tested and put into practice in the laboratory of our own consciousness. So you start to see this change historically in interfaith, where it broadens, so you have the introduction of the Eastern traditions, and it starts to deepen a little bit because people start to realize there's an inner dimension of religion that is usually neglected in interfaith dialogue. But for a long time, and until, in my experience anyway, it was still on the surface because they talked about the inner experience, but they weren't necessarily having the inner experience that they were talking about. So they would talk about mysticism, and it would be a priest, a minister, a rabbi, and now maybe a swami, and they would talk about the mystical practices, but they didn't do them. Isn't, you know, the old joke, a man is walking in the streets of New York and he asks somebody how to get to Carnegie Hall, and the answer is practice, practice, practice. And that's the core message of Vedanta, core message of India. It's not just ideas, it's not just philosophy, it's not just thinking, it's practice, it's experience you need. That's where unity is realized. That's where the goal of life is realized. And so the practices that have come with the philosophy have been introduced into the West as I described last night. And those practices, in addition to the principles, have started to change not only individual lives by the millions, but also the nature of interfaith gatherings. The accessibility of practices like meditation and the yogic repertoire in general, I always compare that to what Henry Ford did to automobiles. Before Henry Ford, only a very few people had these newfangled things called cars. You had to be a privileged person. And it's kind of like that with the contemplative practices of the mystics have evolved over the years. For many, many in the West, it was only a few people who knew about them. The mystically inclined who were lucky enough to find a guru or a teacher or to uncover something in their own tradition that most people didn't know about. They were hidden. And with the advent of the gurus that came from Vivekananda onward, and the Buddhists who also came, you had the accessibility of these practices changed, just like Henry Ford changed by creating the assembly line, and now everybody could have a car. And in the 1920s, everybody could have a radio because of technological advances. Similarly, now practices are available to us, so we don't have to just believe in the unity of I am that and thou art that. We can engage in practices and have these experiences. And thankfully, many interfaith groups have caught on, and they actually now share practices, and they meditate together, and they perhaps chant together in their own tradition or pray together, and they learn from one another's practices and adopt one another's practices and take them in, if they resonate with them, into their lives. And that's where you find the truth of many faiths, one truth, many paths. Truth is one, paths are many, however you want to describe that. It doesn't mean all religions are the same, because when people hear that, they dismiss it as foolishness, because obviously religions are not the same, and that needs to be acknowledged. But what they have at their core is the same, because it's the nature of reality. That's what Vedanta teaches us. How can it be anything but? If you go deep enough and you discover the ultimate, you must come to the same place, because there is only one ultimate. And you know the million of analogies for that, right? So, if you go west from here, and somebody in Oregon goes west from wherever they are, and somebody in New York goes west, eventually you'll all come to the Pacific Ocean, and you'll all have interesting stories about how you got there, and you will all have had different methods for how you got there, but you will come to this same body of salt water.